Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here on blackdoctor.org. I am Ellis Dean, the Director of Digital Programming here at Black Doctor, and we are excited because this is part two of our series with Cedars-Sinai and our partners at Genentech to bring you a six-part series on, we're talking about Alzheimer's and brain and brain health and memory and all of these great things that we know we need, but we don't really think about it too often as we are going through life until we actually need it. And so we did our first presentation about a few weeks ago with Dr. Tan, and we're talking about healthy aging. He did a fantastic presentation on healthy aging. I encourage you to go and watch that program. But today we're here with Dr. Kremen, and now we're going to get down to where, as they say in church sometimes, to where the rubber meets the road. We're going to learn about Alzheimer's. And if you're like me, I'm from the South, and so my grandmother used to say Alzheimer's, but it's all the same thing when we're talking about this particular condition. And so we're going to learn about it today. I'm going to be taking notes myself because I don't know too much about Alzheimer's. And so really going to lean into this program. But there's a couple of things we need to do before we get started with this wonderful information for Dr. Kremen. First thing I need you to do is let us know where you're watching from. Drop that in the comment section. We'd like to know where people are watching us from all over the country, all over the world. Just drop that in the comment section. Number two, if you know somebody that needs this information, maybe they got a family history of it, maybe they're a caregiver or somebody, you never know. If somebody needs this information, tag them, share this on your page and say, hey, you need to watch this. And then finally, if you have questions throughout this presentation today, please put your questions in the comment section and we will get them asked and answered at the end of the presentation, because this is all about getting you information that you can use in your life and in your family's life, or share this information. So we need that. So I am really excited. I'm buckling up my seatbelt really here to get going. So I see some people are already trickling in. Thank you for joining us. Hang around because we're about to have a fantastic presentation with Dr. Kremen. Welcome, Dr. Kremen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
All right, so let's pull up your presentation and you can get us going.
All right. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody to Alzheimer's 101, Everything You Need to Know. My name is Sarah Kremen, and I am a behavioral neurologist at the Yonah Goldrich Center for Alzheimer's Disease and Memory Disorders in the Department of Neurology at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, which is in Los Angeles. And so without further ado, next slide, please. So these are just my disclosures. I have been a site principal investigator in various clinical trials, but I have not represented any pharmaceutical company. And I have been a consultant, an advisory committee for Eli Lilly. Next slide. So I'm going to be covering various topics today, starting with what is normal aging, and then talking about how that's different from dementia. Also, what are the risk factors for dementia, and then what we specifically know about dementia in the Black African-American community, and then talk about specifically what is Alzheimer's disease, how do we diagnose it, and how do we treat it. All right, next slide, please. So first, let's talk about what memory in normal aging is. So all of you, I think, have probably experienced what we call tip of the tongue, which means, you're in a conversation, you're trying to think of somebody's name, or you're trying to think of a word, and you can't come up with it. And then, 12 hours later, it pops up and you're like, oh, I wasn't even trying. And, so that is a very normal phenomenon. That's basically difficulty with retrieving or recall. And we know that as we age, having that difficulty is a normal thing. Basically, we start to experience slower retrieval, slower recall. Essentially, we have the information in the Rolodex, but going through the Rolodex takes a lot longer to go, but it's all in there. And so what that means is that we are able to maintain our ability to learn new information as we go through life, as we're seeing our friends, going to see movies, reading books, doing whatever it is we do every day. We're able to remember that information. We're able to keep up to date, keep our schedule, remember who people are, remember events and the details of those events, and remember our own history, both in the short term and the long term, what we did yesterday and also what we did 20 years ago. All right, next slide. So when is memory loss not a part of normal aging? Because, we all say, oh, well, that's mom. She's just getting older. That's just normal that she has normal aging. And normal that she would have memory problems as she gets older. And, we used to think that for a long time, that was just a normal part of aging. But if you take away anything from today, is to know that having significant memory problems is not a normal part of aging, and it always should be checked into. So what types of things are we talking about? So we're talking about memory loss that disrupts everyday life, and that is a concern. So not being able to learn and retain new information, not keeping a hold of it, asking repetitive questions like what day is it again, or what are we doing again today, or and somebody telling them, but I already told you that schedule, I told it to you twice already, why aren't you remembering it? Not being able to remember where we put stuff, and then having to spend a good amount of time finding the keys, the wallet, the glasses, the phone, and not every once in a while, but like this is a constant thing that's happening on a daily basis. Forgetting how to do familiar tasks. So using the microwave, using the TV remote, knowing how to run the dishwasher, using the washing machine, knowing how to fix things if you're a handy person in the house. Also forgetting how to get to familiar places. So, going and trying to get to the dentist and not remembering how to get there, or how to get home, or how to get to your family member's house. These are all things that are concerning, and should not be looked at just a normal part of aging. Next slide, please. So what are different causes of memory problems? Because not every memory problem is going to be necessarily super serious, right? There's going to be some things that are going to be more serious than others, although all of them need to be addressed and considered. So there are some things that we call reversible. And reversible means that there's something that we could really do about it. For example, we know that sometimes a single medication or being on multiple medications can interfere with each other and cause you to be more clouded and have memory problems. If somebody is depressed, that can cause memory problems. Poor nutrition, if you're severely dehydrated, if you have a thyroid problem, if you have sleep apnea, you're not getting enough oxygen during the night, and that can cause a memory problem, which could be fixed if what you need is, a CPAP machine. That could fix it. But there are some things that are irreversible. For example, if you have a very big stroke, if you sustain head trauma, and you really get a lot of damage from that, and of course, the elephant in the room and the thing that we're talking about today, which is a neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's disease. These things are not reversible. So what is dementia really? Dementia is not a part of normal aging. And I alluded to that before, that having significant memory loss is not a part of normal aging. So what really is dementia? Because I have people that come into clinic and they say, I'm not sure if my mom has dementia or she has Alzheimer's. So I'd like to explain this a little bit and go into a little bit more what that means. So dementia is just a term. It just means you've had a decline in your cognition, which is thinking, and a decline in functional impairment. So the cognitive decline means trouble thinking, trouble with your language, trouble with memory, trouble with judgment, trouble with reasoning. And the functional impairment could be, that means that you're having trouble taking your medications every day, or that you're getting lost driving, that you're forgetting to pay your bills, or you're double paying your bills, that you're not really remembering to eat, or you're not able to prepare your meals because you can't figure out how anymore, or that you're becoming less good at remembering to take a shower when you need to, or to change your clothes when you need to. Those are functional impairments. Or not being able to, say, carry out your job as well, not being able to use the computer the way you used to. These are all functional things. So if you go to the next slide, what you can see is that dementia is really an umbrella term. So when we think of whether somebody has dementia, first we think, do they have a cognitive and functional decline together? And then what is it due to? So it could be due to Alzheimer's disease, which is the number one cause of dementia, which is why you kind of think of them as the same thing. But it could be due to having had a stroke and vascular disease. It could be due to another type of neurodegenerative disease, like dementia with Lewy bodies, or Parkinson's disease, or frontotemporal lobar degeneration. It could be that you have HIV. It could be that you had traumatic brain injury. So dementia really is just the cognitive and functional decline. But then you ask, what does it due to? There's all these different things. For example, yes.
Real quick, sorry, I didn't.
Yeah.
So it's like saying I have a mental illness, and that's kind of the umbrella, but there are specific types: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, that are all
Right.
underneath the umbrella of mental illness. Okay. I got it.
Right. And actually, I was going to just give another one too. So here's another one. It's like saying you have a stomach ache. Okay. Well, what's the stomach ache due to? Is it because you ate something that was bad food? Is it because you ate something you're allergic to? Is it because you ate too much? You know, stomach ache is just a term. Then you got to figure out why you have the stomach ache. Same thing. All right. So how common is dementia? Well, we estimate that it affects 50 million people worldwide. We know that there are about 8.86 million Americans who have dementia. And if you look below, we've tried to break it down into percentages in terms of ethnicity and race. You can see that about 36% of people who have dementia are African American, 25% are non-Hispanic white, about 30% are Latino. You have about 7% who are Asian, and then the rest, 11% is split between Pacific Islander and Native American. So you can see that there are some groups that are affected more than others, although we also don't probably have complete data on everybody either, because it depends, you know, how we get this data and how we can really access that information to accurately report this. Next slide. So when you think about risk factors for dementia in general, it's really quite an interesting thing that we think now that there are some really good ways that we can make an impact and reduce our risk on developing dementia. And it's across the lifespan, which is really interesting. So for example, if you look at the top of the slide where it has green and it says less education, we can attribute it about 7% of our risk of developing dementia is if we have less education. And this means like preschool. So it's really important to send our kids to preschool. It actually has effect much later in life because we know that education provides us the mental flexibility later in life and the way it provides neuronal strength and connections, really good neuronal connections in our brain later in life that protects us later on from disease and helps us problem solve and get through things better later. In midlife, you have things like hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, high blood pressure, excess alcohol, and obesity, which all can contribute to dementia. And then you have in later life, smoking, depression, social isolation, physical inactivity, air pollution, and diabetes. We know all contribute. And I can tell you that altogether, as you can see this slide says, this is 40% of our risk that's modifiable potentially, which is amazing. And this does not include other things like vision loss. It doesn't include things like sleep disorders or lack of sleep. So there's a lot of other things that are probably going to be added to this chart as research continues, because we know that all these things contribute to our risk of dementia. And next slide, please. So when we look at cognitive impairment and dementia in the African-American Black community, what you can see is that if you look on the right hand of the slide, looking at the percentage of adults age 65 and older who have Alzheimer's disease, you can see that 14% of Black American, African Americans have Alzheimer's disease compared to 12% Hispanic Latinx and 10% non-Hispanic white. On the left-hand side, if you look at the prevalence of cognitive impairment, meaning right now, if you look in the population, how many or what percentage of the people have cognitive impairment of some sort, you can see, first of all, that as people get older, there's a greater percentage of people who have cognitive impairment, such that by the time people are 85 and older, almost over 50% of people who are African American and Black have cognitive impairment. So this is a real issue. It really exists, and it's something that we need to really be educating people about and doing something about it. So next slide, please. So again, just another slide showing that within the African American community, there are various health disparities between African Americans and other groups. We see that they're 44% more likely to die from a stroke, 23% more likely to be obese, 25% more likely to die from a heart attack, from heart disease, 72% more likely to be diabetic, and twice as likely to have Alzheimer's disease compared to, say, a non-Hispanic white. So this is just, Alzheimer's is just one of the other important medical conditions that we really need to keep our eyes out for and that need to be talked about with healthcare providers when you go to see your healthcare provider, because these risks are real and we can make an impact that can improve people's health. Next slide, please. So again, just looking at the risk of dementia after somebody reaches the age of 65, again, African American group is at the top of the list for 38% will develop risk of developing dementia. So more than more than American Indian, Latino, White, Asian American, and Pacific Islanders. And there's a lot of research looking into why this is. Why is this particular group most at risk? So next slide, please. So this is meant to be an active slide, but that's okay. We'll just separate it out. So it's supposed to be animated. So if you look underneath, there are more than 6 million Americans right now living with Alzheimer's disease in the country. And underneath there, of the 145%, it basically is comparing the fact that over the past 20 years or so, the risk of heart disease has significantly declined, but the risk of Alzheimer's disease has actually increased by 145%. And the cost in 2022 to take care of Alzheimer's and other dementias is $321 billion, which is expected to increase by 2050 to $1 trillion. So this is a really big deal. And then on top of that, so that information comes from Alzheimer's Association, which is covered by the Us Against Alzheimer's logo there. But then from Us Against Alzheimer's, and then they add that 20% of Americans with the disease are African American, and they bear 33% of the national cost of this disease. So it's a very, very expensive disease to take care of that we could try to make an impact on. So what now is Alzheimer's disease? So Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, and that means that neurons are basically dying in our brain. The neurons specifically help us with thinking. They make up the outer layer of your brain, and they're connected to other neurons in other parts of the outer layer of your brain by tracks called white matter. So the neurons basically are helping you think, right? Helping you process information, helping you make decisions, helping interpret what you see, helping you remember things. So what happens over time, we think, partly, is that there is an accumulation of inflammation, and the brain tries to fix that or tries to heal that. And one of the ways that it tries to do that is by sending another protein called amyloid to help sort of wall off infections, wall off injury, and you get something called, as you can see at the top there, there's something called A beta aggregation. That means that amyloid, which is one of these proteins, builds up in between the neurons of the brain and starts forming clumps called plaques. And when you have these plaques, it's very inflammatory. The brain doesn't like it very much. And in addition, having those plaques kicks off an abnormal process within the neurons themselves. And inside the neurons, if you can imagine, a neuron has to have a structure. Just like inside of our body, we have a skeleton. You know, that's why we have a shape, a bunch of other reasons why we have a skeleton. But it gives you structure. So neurons have a skeleton inside too. And it's part of which is held together by a protein called tau. So when there's a lot of inflammation and you get a buildup of the first protein, amyloid, outside of the neurons, inside the neuron, it detects that, and the tau starts to misfold and the skeleton starts to crumble. And when the skeleton starts to crumble, the neuron can't function and it starts to die. So when neurons start to die, then they can't communicate with each other. And when they can't communicate with each other, that's when you start to see somebody having cognitive difficulties, memory problems, or behavioral changes with depression, or maybe lack of initiative, not caring, not wanting to do things, or maybe they even start, having paranoia. Who knows? They can have any number of symptoms, but it's because the neurons are starting to dysfunction and die. So next slide, please. So what we know is that these proteins start to build up in the brain in different areas. The top row is looking at a map of where amyloid starts in the brain, and the bottom row is where the tau starts to misfold and the neurons are starting to die. And essentially what you can see is, for the most part, it spreads. It starts in a small area and then it spreads throughout the brain. And in most people, though not all, because the disease isn't the same entirely for everybody, these proteins start building up in the memory centers of the brain. And that's why typically Alzheimer's disease shows up as a disease of short-term memory problems, because those neurons in that area are being affected first. And then as the disease progresses, you might see other symptoms. As it's spreading throughout the brain, it starts to go into the area that affects language, or it starts to go into the area that affects visual spatial skills. And that's why you see those changes. Next slide. So now this is sort of the updated, but somewhat kind of simplified version of what's really happening in Alzheimer's. So what I just presented to you is the hypothesis. It's called the amyloid hypothesis. That's what I was showing you. And that has been the predominant hypothesis for why Alzheimer's might be developing. And it forms the basis for a lot of research, and it is a good way of thinking about Alzheimer's disease. But it's actually more complicated than that. We know that over time, there are many risk factors and contributors to Alzheimer's disease. The number one risk factor, honestly, for Alzheimer's is aging. Every single one of us has that as a risk factor. As we get older, we are all at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So between aging and genetics, those are two things that we can't really change, but we all have as risk factors. But there's all these other things aside from, from that. So as I showed you before, you remember a couple slides ago, it depends on your lifestyle, it depends on your diet, depends whether you're smoking. Do you have vascular risk factors like high blood pressure or diabetes? We're looking at environment. But now we also know your social interactions. Do you have a lot of social interactions with people? How much education have you gotten? Are you taking care of depression? If you're depressed, are you sleeping well? Those things contribute. And then on top of that, even newer topics, which I've colored in pink and green, we're now looking at the gut health or our oral health, if our dental health is poor, that might actually be a risk factor. We had no idea in the past that there might be a connection between dental health and the risk for developing Alzheimer's, but now there might be. And the same thing looking at inflammatory pathways and even the differences between men and women and our hormonal differences. There may be different risks for whether you're a woman or a man and developing Alzheimer's dementia. So all these different things are then coming together, and the final common pathway then may be the accumulation of amyloid and tau. So let's talk about some common symptoms. First of all, as I alluded to before, one of the main symptoms is trouble with short-term memory, right? So not remembering conversations that happened in the past day, the past week, repeating questions, repeating stories, and oftentimes using the same wording every time of a story. It's always worded the same way. Forgetting the day, forgetting the date. It's very easy to forget those things. And yes, sometimes they'll telling me, well, I don't work, I'm retired. True, I get it. That I hope also that I forget the day and date when I go on vacation. But this is really something that happens really all the time, more regularly, so that you're disoriented to what's going on.
My mother said that when she retired, every day was Tuesday.
Right, exactly. Right. So other things like forgetting where you put something. So forgetting where you put your keys, your wallet, your phone, and sometimes even thinking that people stole it, right? Because you don't remember where you put it. Therefore, somebody must have stolen it. Right. Forgetting to take medications correctly, forgetting appointments, showing up on the wrong day to the doctor, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. People will also have word finding difficulties beyond just tip of the tongue, what I discussed at the beginning. So this is having more difficulty where the word isn't going to pop up every time, that sometimes the word never pops up back in your brain. Trouble with visual spatial skills, meaning getting lost when you're walking in the neighborhood or when you're driving. And sometimes it affects things like not being able to navigate places that are less familiar. And then over time, it also starts to include places that you do know well. It also may be like losing a car in the parking lot, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then we see changes in behavior. So people can become more irritable. They may be depressed. And in the bottom there, you can't see it too well, but it says anxiety. People also may express less interest, sometimes what we call apathy, where they just don't care about doing things anymore. And it seems like they're depressed, and we have to kind of figure out, is it depression or is it that they're not bothered by anything anymore? They could care less about whether they're involved in something or not. So those are some of the major common symptoms that we see. Go ahead.
We're going to stick a pin in that irritability and paranoia, because I think that a lot of the people that I know that have aging parents that are kind of dealing with dementia type symptoms, that's always been the common theme, is that hostileness, the aggressiveness. Even in the comments, we've got Tam Collins said that her mother has Lewy body dementia, and it's like living in a war zone every day. So probably need to kind of talk about that when we get to our Q&A.
Sure. All right. So the first message is, if there's any concern about memory or language or visual spatial skills, you should tell your doctor. And it's really important because getting a diagnosis and getting a proper diagnosis is very, very important. The reason is because we can evaluate for various causes of cognitive impairment. It may not end up being anything like Alzheimer's at all, right? It could just be a vitamin B12 deficiency, easy to fix. So, or sleep apnea, we can fix that. So it's really important that you go and address this and address it early, because we want to do and get you the right appropriate treatment, whatever that may be. And if it turns out that it's something like Alzheimer's disease, there's always an opportunity not just to get the correct treatment and jump on it early, but also there's an opportunity for clinical trial participation, because there are new medications that are being tried now, and some of them are going to come to market. And the only way we're going to get that to happen is for people to participate in research. Lastly, it's really important. You need to make a plan for care, no matter what it is, no matter what illness you have. And it's never good to try to make a plan when there's an emergency. Better to make a plan ahead of time. And particularly if this is going to be something like Alzheimer's, but you are able to think and talk now, then it's important to get your paperwork in order when people know what you want. People want to act on your behalf, but you need to designate who those people are and know that that they know what you want later in life if for some reason you can't express that later on. So it's really important to work with your physician. That could be an internist, like a general practitioner. It could be a geriatrician who specializes in seeing people over the age of 65. It could be a neurologist like me. It could be a psychiatrist or a geriatric psychiatrist. Any one of us can do a workup for memory concern. Next slide. So how do we diagnose dementia due to Alzheimer's disease? Again, see your doctor. And what we do is first take an interview you. Basically, it's called taking a history, and ask you, when did it start? How long has it been going? Was it sudden? Is it gradual? What are the features? What are the things you're having problems with? And then we'll do a physical exam. We want to make sure that we see how you move, how your coordination is, how your reflexes are, because that gives us a sense of, should I be thinking about somebody had a stroke or not? Or does this seem like they have Parkinson's or not? That kind of thing. We will do some sort of cognitive testing. Sometimes it's just a screening test. Sometimes it might be a little bit more involved. Sometimes if we're not sure, we might send you to somebody called a neuropsychologist to get a more in-depth cognitive testing where they really push you on memory and language and visual spatial skills. And then we order blood tests, right? So we want to make sure you don't have a thyroid problem, make sure you're not anemic, make sure that you don't have any imbalances in terms of sodium or potassium, make sure that you're not diabetic. And, all these things are really important. And oftentimes, and really important, we need to get a brain scan. Mm-hmm. Now, being that I'm a neurologist, my bias is you get a brain MRI because it's a better picture for detail. If you go to the ER, they get CT scans. There's a reason for that, because they're quick. And when they're worried about something emergency, it's the quicker thing to do. And it picks up things like, trauma and blood very well. But on the outpatient side, brain MRI is really the better scan to be looking for more detailed things. And sometimes we'll even go even further if we're not sure and order something called a PET scan, which I do have a picture of later on. And that shows activity of the brain. If you have a history of stroke or heart attack, we may also do a scan of your neck and brain vessels. We may do an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound of your heart to look at how your heart is functioning, how it's pumping, maybe get an EKG to see if you have any abnormal rhythms that put you at risk for stroke. And again, as I mentioned, if we're not really sure what's going on, we might send you for more cognitive testing with a neuropsychologist. Next slide. So here is an MRI. And basically, you can see there are 3 panels. On the left-hand side is normal aging. In the middle is somebody who has mild cognitive impairment. What that means is they have cognitive decline, but no functional decline. And then on the far hand side is somebody with dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. So again, somebody who has a functional decline as well as the cognitive decline. And what you can see is that there's a red arrow in each one of them pointing to a particular structure in the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is very important for encoding new memories. So this is where it's basically the tape recorder of the brain lives. And when that tape recorder doesn't work well, then that's why you don't record information well. And that's why you have a short-term memory problem. So you can see with normal aging, their hippocampus looks pretty good. The next panel over in mild cognitive impairment, it looks a little bit small. And then somebody with Alzheimer's disease, oftentimes, though not always, may have a smaller hippocampus, which shows that there's been neurodegeneration, that the neurons are dying, and now you have that area that's shrinking in size. Next slide. So I told you I would show you a picture of a PET scan. So this is a PET scan. So where the MRI was really a nice picture, and you can see structure and all the different parts of the brain, the PET scan is kind of fuzzy, not the greatest picture, but that's because it's looking at function. So essentially how you get this picture is your brain and your whole body uses glucose, which is sugar, to run. That's why you eat. You were breaking down the food into sugar, and your body stores it or uses it. So in order to think, you need to have glucose, you need to have sugar. So what happens is you go into get the PET scan, they give you an IV, and it's basically IV glucose, IV sugar that goes into your brain, but it's also radio labeled. They can tag it with a little molecule that then the PET scanner can see that molecule. And so it can see the activity of your brain and which parts of your brain are working well and which are not. And so this actually is a picture of normal aging, mild cognitive, and Alzheimer's disease. But what I see is that there is one error. If you look at the bottom where it says Alzheimer's disease, you can see how much red there is. That actually is normal aging. So the label is off. The label is incorrect. So this is normal aging. There's good red. They've color coded it. Your brain doesn't shine red. They've color coded it. More red means more activity. And that's good. That's what we want to see. At the middle, you can see there's a little bit less. And by the time you get to the top, the incorrect label that says normal aging should say Alzheimer's disease. And you can see between that row and the bottom row how much less red there is. That's because those areas of the brain are not acting, and they're not as active as they should be. And this particular pattern, particularly of the hippocampus, and I don't know if I can use my arrow here. I don't know if you can see it. But in the back of the brain here, there's this area here. This is very significant for Alzheimer's disease, as well as the middle here, which is where the hippocampus is. So next slide. Okay. Some of you may have heard of a different kind of PET scan. This is an amyloid PET scan. So this is a different kind of scan where instead of looking at activity of the brain, it actually looks at the amyloid protein in the brain. So remember I told you about amyloid building up in the brain and being irritative to the brain and then causing the tau to also misfold. So this basically looks at how much amyloid you have in your brain. So with normal aging on the left, you see there's not very much. In the middle, you can see this is somebody who has mild cognitive impairment, and they have more. And the person all the way on the right has dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. You can see there's a huge burden. Now, the one caveat to this is with normal aging, we all tend to have an increase in amyloid anyway. So just because you have amyloid in your brain doesn't mean that you have Alzheimer's disease. I know that seems confusing, but amyloid is only one part of the picture, and it doesn't make the diagnosis.
Right. So basically you could have amyloid buildup, but as long as you just have that tip of the tongue memory situation versus kind of, I forgot my date of birth kind of situation, and you're functioning, are you bumping into things? Are you not remembering where you put things down in the house? So you have to pair it with their functioning in order to determine if it's
right,
significant or not. Okay.
Exactly. Right. The big takeaway message is that the way to make a diagnosis doesn't hang on one thing.
Right.
It mostly hangs on, frankly, the story, the history is so important, and getting those details and everything else, the testing, the brain imaging, the blood work, all of it comes together like a puzzle. And when we got to look at the whole picture. So you can never make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease off of a scan, never, because you could have a lot of amyloid and not have dementia at all. If you look at a brain MRI, there are people who go through their entire lives. They're in a study. That's how we know this, right? They're being followed along longitudinally, and they die at age, 95. They volunteered to have their brain cut up in sections for research. And they may have the most shrunken brain, but they didn't, on cognitive testing, every year that they came in for testing, they were testing absolutely fine and did not have dementia. On the flip side, you could have somebody who has a very beautifully looking brain, plump, no shrinking, no nothing, and they could have dementia. So, it all depends. It's not just the scan.
And I like the way that when you were talking earlier about ruling out other, kind of more simpler,
Mhm.
definitions, of why you're having some cognitive impairment versus running right to dementia and Alzheimer's and all these other things. You say, okay, let's go through this checklist, make sure it physically there's not something that's easier to treat versus going into something that might be more complicated and difficult.
Right. So, how do we treat dementia due to Alzheimer's disease? So, there are some medications that you may have heard of that are approved for Alzheimer's disease. Some of you may have heard of them. They're Aricept or donepezil. There's also Exelon, which is also known as rivastigmine, and then there's Razidine, known as galantamine. What those drugs do is they don't change the course of the disease. They cannot prevent or slow down the disease. They're not acting on the amyloid. They're not acting on the tau. But what they are doing is trying to boost the neurons that are in the hippocampus by boosting up one of the chemicals that we know that our brain makes that helps us with memory, called acetylcholine, and it tries to boost the acetylcholine level in the brain. So for as long as you have neurons that are able to take advantage of that because they're still healthy, that's what we do. And we do know that these medications can help. It's subtle. It is not like giving somebody a blood pressure medication. It's not like giving them a cholesterol medication. I would never say like that these are a panacea, but it can help in terms of trying to make people be sharper and maybe improve things a little bit for a longer time. The other medication that we have that's approved is called memantine or Namenda, and it works on a different type of chemical in the brain, and it works all over the brain. It doesn't have a specific area that it works on. And sometimes you'll see that these medications are used together. So you'll have Aricept and Namenda working together. That's not infrequent. There is one other medication that was recently approved last summer called aducanumab or Aduhelm. This medication is approved for Alzheimer's disease, and it's a monthly infusion. It's the first to actually be trying to treat the actual underlying protein of amyloid, but it is not covered by insurance. And so most people are not accessing this drug, and it's not just because it's not covered by insurance. There's also a little bit of a controversy about whether it's really able to slow down cognitive decline. And that's probably outside of the scope of today's talk, but just to know if you've heard of that medication, it is approved by the FDA. However, not many people are using it, and many clinicians are not actually prescribing it at this time. But it is the first, and so it is sort of, it's a game changer for the future. There may be other medications coming soon that will be similar to that, that might end up being prescribed in the future. And there is one other medication. I tend to forget about it, but it's called Namzaric. And it's not really a new medication. It's basically just a combination. So it's a combination of the Aricept and the memantine together in one pill. So They're trying to simplify things by you taking it just once a day. Okay, so what are the other things that we do if you have this diagnosis? Well, obviously, it's very important to treat all the other medical conditions you might have. So managing blood pressure, managing cholesterol, managing a thyroid disorder, diabetes, obstructive sleep apnea, all these things, because we want your brain to be the best it can be. And we don't want you to end up having a stroke. We don't want you to end up having a thyroid that's out of whack, because that can make you more confused. So we want to handle those things. Moving on, other things, make sure you get your hearing checked. Make sure you have your vision checked. There are 2 papers that just came out, different ones, showing how important it is to have hearing intact, vision intact, because not being able to hear and not being able to see, whatever the reason is, contributes to dementia. Okay. You should only drink in moderation. That means 1 drink for women, 2 drinks for men, 8 ounces of beer, not very much. There are some papers showing that even drinking at all is not good. So don't smoke. I think that one we don't need to say anymore. That's been out for a long time. Sleep is really important. Getting 7 hours of sleep a night is very important. So if you have sleep apnea, if you're the kind of person that just wakes up a lot during the night, let's try to figure out why. And let's see if we can fix that. If you're somebody who's rolling around for 2 hours before you can go to bed, let's figure out why, and we can try to change your sleep hygiene to fix that. And lastly, taking care of mental health, is such a taboo. It's such a stigma to even, I have schizophrenia, I have bipolar disorder, I have depression. But we know that these things contribute to inflammation in the brain, contribute to memory problems. So if there's an issue with anxiety, depression, don't be scared. You got to go get it. You got to treat it. It's really, really important, and not be ashamed about it.
So quick question about the sleep, because I know this has come up before. That sleep does not include naps, right? So it can't be
right.
You slept 2 hours in a nap here, 3 hours in a nap there, and then 3 hours of nights. Hey, that's it's 8 hours of sleep, but it's chopped up. So you want contiguous, full 7 hours in a row of sleep.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, sometimes as people get older, they feel they need to take a nap. And we're not totally against naps, but you really need to keep them on the shorter end, 45 minutes,
Right.
half an hour. And it's better to do it earlier in the day. The closer you take it to bedtime, the later in the afternoon, it really then disrupts your whole sleep cycle.
Okay.
So it's not bad to take a cat nap, but what's not good is taking 2 hours, 3 hour nap during the day, because then you can't fall asleep at night. So the whole goal is be up during the day, be active, make sure you're seeing the sun, let your brain see the sun, because there is actually a detector in your brain that can tell whether it's light or dark, and is sort of signaling to your brain at different times, hey, you should be awake now, or, oh, it's nighttime, you should be asleep now. So if you're not sort of doing that, then it doesn't help you get into a good rhythm. Where this becomes trouble is people who you're on the night shift, right? That becomes really hard, obviously. Yeah. So just as important, exercise, exercise, exercise. You should be exercising 30 minutes a day. It can be walking, it can be jogging, it can be water aerobics, whatever it is. But we know that exercise not only is important for your heart, for your lungs, it's helpful to reduce inflammation in your brain. It helps you feel better. It makes you happier. And we know it slows down degeneration. So there have been studies in mice, in rats, in humans that have looked at exercise versus not, and following people over time with cognitive tests and with brain MRIs. And what they found is that exercise actually improves memory, and it can even improve the size of the hippocampus, which is pretty cool. However, it's only maintained if you keep exercising. It doesn't last. So you have to stay on it.
I can't hit a treadmill once and I'm good.
No, I'm so sorry. It's also really important to stay engaged with friends and family. We know this, and I think actually all of us have now experienced this a little bit with COVID. If anything, COVID really proved this point. You have to stay engaged with people. If you're lonely, if you're depressed, that really contributes to cognitive decline. And we have studies looking at the more the more social connections people have later in life, the better they do cognitively. So that could be, going to join people in exercise. It could be talking with people. It could be anything, as long as you're having fun and you're staying engaged. And lastly, challenge yourself in fun brain activities. And that could be Sudoku, could be crosswords. But if you hate those things, that's okay. You don't have to do them, but do something that you like, right? If you like fishing, go figure out how to tie a new, fly. I don't know. If you like book club, do book club. If you like quilting, do quilting. Do something, because those things use your brain, and they put you in a social situation where you can interact with people. And all those things are really important. All right. So that comes to the end of my talk. So I'm happy to take any questions.
It's funny. I watched. I read a study, and they were talking about it was for longevity, and they were testing, the people, and they looked at people that lived 90 plus years old, and they did all these risks, all these factors, and they found out that the number one factor for the people that lived the longest was engagement with other people.
Right.
That was the most common thread. So it wasn't about living healthy. So still eat healthy, still exercise, but that engagement with others is paramount to really living a long, fulfilled life, because and it's not even just friends and family. It could just be strangers going to the grocery store, talking to the cashier, going to a restaurant, sitting at the bar area and engaging in a conversation with somebody there or with the bartender. Just that social interaction is a key factor to living a long life. So, so yeah, so there's been some great questions. They start coming in at the end. So one of the first questions was, and I'm going to go back to that one of your original slides, because
Sure.
the question was really about, they wanted you to review this umbrella again in
Sure.
terms of dementia. So people joined late and they're like, can you talk about the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? And I'm like,
Yeah,
I said earlier, but
I
we're going to,
know.
because this is important. This is important. So kind of revisit this stuff so people can kind of really grasp it.
Yes, absolutely. So again, yes, you're right. We get the question all the time. As I said, every question. I mean, once a week, does my mom have dementia or does she have Alzheimer's? So it's all good. This is like, that's why we're here. So so again, dementia just means, it's just a syndrome and it's just a term. It's a definition. It just means that somebody has experienced a cognitive decline. For example, a decline in thinking, reasoning, memory, language, visual spatial skills, and it's accompanied by a functional decline as well. So not being able to remember to take your medications, not being able to carry out your job the way you used to, not being able to pay your bills, not being able to take your medications, not being able to use your phone. Exactly, this slide. So together, cognitive decline and functional impairment together is dementia. And again, it's not a part of normal aging. We used to think it was, now we know that it's definitely not. So together, those two things equals dementia. As I mentioned later in my talk, there is something called mild cognitive impairment. That's where you have a cognitive decline, but not functional decline. So there is something, you perceive that you're having a memory problem. You go to the doctor, they test you, they see you have a memory problem, but you're still able to pay your bills. You're still able to do all the things you need to do on a daily basis. You don't have functional decline. That's mild cognitive impairment. And then there's dementia, where you have the functional impairment. And then once you make that establishment, like in the clinic, okay, this person has had a cognitive and functional decline. Now we say, well, what is it due to? Is it due to Alzheimer's disease? Is it due to vascular disease because you had a stroke? Is it due to dementia with Lewy bodies, which is another type of neurodegenerative disease? Is it due to Parkinson's disease? Is it due to HIV? Is it due to traumatic brain injury? So there's all these different reasons why you could have dementia. All these different reasons. It's just that Alzheimer's disease is so common. It accounts for 70% of all types of dementia is Alzheimer's. That's how common it is, that in the lay terms, like that's why we think, oh, Alzheimer's has sort of stepped in for every dementia there is, but actually it's not true. It's really dementia and what type of dementia after that.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that was a fantastic question. So I'm glad we were able to revisit that, because that was really, yep. Well, no. So Dominic, so there's a comment here: cognitive decline plus functional decline equals Alzheimer's disease. No. She's saying a cognitive decline plus a functional decline equals dementia.
There you go.
And Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. It is the most common type of dementia, but Alzheimer's is not all inclusive of dementia. So there's not a direct correlation. You can't use the term interchangeably.
No.
Dementia.
Yeah. Not to bend your minds too much, but if you think about it, this is why Alzheimer's disease doesn't equal dementia. Alzheimer's disease takes 20 years to develop, at least. It's happening silently over the course of time. And by the time somebody comes in to be seen, and because they're having a memory problem, this has been percolating for probably 15, 20 years.
Right.
But it's not like it showed up one day. It's not like Alzheimer's disease showed up one day and suddenly one day you had dementia. I mean, it really goes slowly. But what happens in between the time that you were normal and that you have this dementia? Well, you passed through something that's also made up. It's a made up term, mild cognitive impairment. So you could have mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease. That's different than dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. I don't mean to be confusing, but right. So Alzheimer's disease, you pass through these different clinical stages. So You could also have mild cognitive impairment due to depression. That could be fixed. You could have mild cognitive impairment due to sleep apnea. That can be fixed, right? You don't have to have dementia due to obstructive sleep apnea if you fix it. So these are just terms to describe clinically what's not normal. Normal, somewhere in the middle, which is mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. So.
So there's a couple of couple of good questions while while we have you here. Okay. How or what, this is from Monica. She's, you know, how or what do you do when a person has elderly siblings who adds to this disease by agreeing with all said? And I think what she's referring to is her first comment, which says, my mom, she's she's saying she's talking to herself and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
answering herself.
Mm-hmm.
And she said sometimes she forgets we are there, and she talks to herself, and her conversations are very negative and hostile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is some of the behavioral issues that can crop up that can be very challenging, very, very challenging. So I think the biggest thing is that we should not overlook, and we are going to be talking about this, I think, later on in these sessions, not focused specifically today, but about the role that caregivers play in taking care of dementia. It's super challenging as a caregiver to understand what you should do in these situations where either somebody is either saying things that aren't true, but they believe to be true. And what do you do about that? Like, do you stand in and correct them on
Mhm.
the truth all the time?
Right.
Or as you're saying, somebody who's talking and it seems like they're even talking to themselves and then getting all upset about it. Or I've had people that look in the mirror and don't recognize themselves and start having an argument with themselves. They don't recognize themselves anymore. And they're
Right.
starting to get angry at the person in the mirror, which is
Right.
really challenging. For that one, I say put a sheet over the mirror, and that way they just can't see themselves.
Right.
So, what I would say is if somebody is saying something like, say they recall an event and it's not how it happened, it's probably not worth the argument to correct them if they really believe that they're right. Because if you think about it from their point of view, since they don't realize they have a memory problem, whatever they perceive, it's their truth. It may not be the truth of what happened, but that's what they think. And you're not going to necessarily be able to persuade them all the time that what happened is different. So you kind of just need to roll with it and just change the topic of conversation, or, just, you don't have to fight on that because it's going to be a really hard thing to fight. What I would say for somebody who's getting upset with themselves because they're having a self conversation is if it's getting upsetting, disruly, putting anybody in harm's way, like your mom getting, all so upset and riled up, there may be, if you can't sort of change the topic, get her distracted, onto something more pleasant, get her involved, like, hey, let's listen to music, or get her involved in something she likes to do. If
Mhm.
that doesn't work, that's what we try to do, is not use medication. But sometimes if we can't do that, sometimes you need medication just to keep somebody a little bit calmer so that their brain doesn't kind of go down that ruminative track of getting themselves more agitated.
Right. So a couple of questions because we're coming close to our time. So this is a good question from Tam. How can we make sure that it's not hereditary?
Oh, that's such a good question.
What can I do to make sure?
I realized I didn't put anything about familial stuff in here. So here's the brief genetic talk on Alzheimer's. Okay, so of all the Alzheimer's disease we have, there's about 1%, only 1% of all people who get Alzheimer's where it is truly like autosomal dominant, meaning that if you get this gene, you will get Alzheimer's. You cannot escape it. Only 1% of people. This tends to be people who have early onset under the age of 50, 55. They're getting it every generation, multiple siblings. They're getting it at age 30, age 40. And it's due to three main genes: presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor protein. Okay. It's very rare, is what there's some families that they're following in Colombia and other places. It's very rare. Then you have the typical kind of, Alzheimer's disease where, yes, it's running in families, but it's not one gene necessarily. It's kind of across multiple genes. And we know what some of them are, but none of them are as strong as the one I just told you about. But there is one called ApoE4. And the ApoE4 gene does confer increased risk. Does not mean you'll get the disease, but it does confer risk. So if you get one copy of a gene from your mom and one from your dad, that's how things work. So if you get one copy of ApoE4, it increases your risk by 4 times. If you get 2 copies, it increases your risk by 12 times. Still doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. It does raise your risk, but there's not a guaranteed outcome that that's what's going to happen. The other thing I would say is this, just generally within families, not even looking at ApoE4, that if you have a direct relative, a father or a mother or a sibling, then you have a 1.5 times risk of developing Alzheimer's disease if they have it. But it's spread across many genes. So it's not a guarantee. It's not a slam dunk that just because you have a relative that has dementia that you will too. But certainly, if you have a concern, it is something to mention to the person, to the physician who's going to be evaluating you. We do want to know that. We do take that into consideration. Thank you for mentioning that.
And there's a number of companies out there that are offering genetic testing, and so
Right.
you can engage in that on your own if you feel comfortable doing that, and having and getting that reading so you can know whether or not you're carrying those genes. There is a question about hydrochloroquine and use some medications.
Hydrochloroquine. Okay.
Yeah.
So hydrochloroquine's not used in this at all. So that I wouldn't do.
Okay.
Donepezil, yes, we talked about. That's one of the oldest medications out there and it's also called Aricept. And yes, it's frequently used. And so yes, to the donepezil. CT scans so let's put it this way. Again, as I said, you can't make a diagnosis of dementia from a scan. What you're using the scan for is to see, has somebody had a stroke? Do they have a tumor? Are there parts of the brain that have shrunken, that are smaller than they should be, that would contribute information to help you understand why somebody might be having a memory problem and dementia? But you don't make a diagnosis of dementia off the scan, because dementia really is getting the story, right? If you look at a scan, you could have any kind of injury, and it could be infection, it could be inflammation, it could be stroke. Without knowing the history behind the person who has that scan, it could be a lot of different things. So yeah, the scan is helpful, but it's not that's not what we hang our hat on to absolutely make a diagnosis.
All right. And finally, I want to get this was a great question. Are there support groups for caregivers?
Yes. So there are many. What I would say is, depending on what city you live in, there are support groups. Some of them are through Alzheimer's Association, which is a national group, but there are local associations too. For example, I live in Los Angeles, and so in Los Angeles, we also have Alzheimer's Association, and we have Alzheimer's Los Angeles. You will find wherever you live that there is probably a local group, and if not, you can jump onto national groups. There's also other ones, probably through Us Against Alzheimer's. There's lots of groups. So absolutely, there are support groups for caregivers, and you should seek them out because they can be very helpful. And we're going to be talking about this in another session, I believe.
Yeah, we definitely will.
Yeah.
But and also the beautiful thing about, we understand there's a lot of bad things about, social media. But one of the good things about social media is there's probably, if you just did a search on Facebook, you'll probably find a group there, and you can get a lot of information from people just sharing in those groups as well. And so just, you can find it. That is when Dr. Google does come in. Is handy, is you can find support groups, but there are numbers. So I would start with the organizations, because they can point you in the right direction and get you to a legitimate group to be supportive of you and what you're going through. And we do recognize we are going to do a program. This is show 2 of a 6-part series, and we are going to have a show later on in this series about caregivers. So I would encourage you to come back and watch that program, because we're going to have a host of information about what it means, tips, techniques, things that you can do as a caregiver. So just please look forward to that. I want to thank all of you all for jumping in today and your great questions. Kyle, Monica, Tam, Jacqueline, everybody, Shanika, everybody that was with us today. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Dr. Kremen. Thank you to our partners at Genentech, as well as our partners at Cedars-Sinai, for providing some great physicians that can give some information to us. Please, you're not alone in this situation. Please remember, I understand it is a tremendous effort and tremendous undertaking to care for somebody that has dementia, the umbrella, and in any one of those types of dementia. However, please understand that there are resources available to you and that you're not alone, and take care of yourself, because you cannot pour from an empty cup. And with that, we're going to sign off, and I'll say thank you again, and we'll see you next time.